Welcome everyone. Today is Family Meeting Sunday. If you're watching this video on this Sunday afternoon, right now I am probably stuck exchanging banalities and trivialities with twice removed uncles I didn't even know I had. So please, for this moment only, pray for me and the lethal boredom I am going through right now. But what we have to go over for today is the announcement from a few hours ago, I guess yesterday, by Blizzard that the next reset is going to have a balance tuning for some specs. And this time around, there is no bad feeling because it's just buffs. Okay, there are no nerfs yet. It's just buffs. Now, let's go and take a look which of these specs have been targeted by these buffs for, I guess, a few days from now. So what we have in front of us right now is the amount of popularity in the raid for all of the tanks and all of the DPS as well. It's pretty handy that we went over Mythic Plus and the raid in the last couple of days, so we can better picture who exactly is getting these buffs. These are the specs available, and these are the specs that have gotten buffed. These are all of the specs at the moment. So, of course, some people will lament the fact of some specs like Affliction lacking some buffs, perhaps even Shadow Priest not getting buffed. Retribution Paladin is another hot topic of buffness that gets discussed. But for the moment, these are the specs that Blizzard has decided to help in this first two resets of Mythic Sepulcher. So let's start with the first one. This is likely Blizzard not enjoying too much the fact that Frost Death Knight has overtaken Unholy in pretty much any type of PvE content. So the first buff goes to Unholy. All damage of Unholy is increased by 5%. So just a flat out damage increase to Unholy. As I said, if we had to buff one of the two specs, then Unholy was the recipient, because Frost is doing better. Doesn't mean it's one of the best, doesn't mean it's the meta pick, it's not the meta pick in Mythic Plus. It is doing better in Red Encounter, so it's still not as meta and as wanted as a few other melee DPS specs. So Unholy, on the other hand, was not doing nearly as well, so it's a pretty expected buff to Unholy. Then we move over to another spec which is in an even worse situation than Unholy. And when is this spec ever been in a good situation? It's Feral Druid. Feral Druid gets all damage increased by 3%, but additionally they also get 10% more damage to Primal Wrath, 20% more damage to Brutal Slash, 15% more damage to Swipe, and 20% more damage to Thrash. This is kind of what happens when you relentlessly butcher the 4-piece AoE of Feral. Then you are stuck trying to fix it 1 month into the patch with some more AoE buffs. The situation of Feral is of course quite bad. It is, I'm not gonna say a surprise, it is the least represented spec in Mythic Plus. Not just out of melee, out of every single role. Even losing to Affliction, it's losing to Arms that nobody is playing right now because everyone is playing Fury. Every spec is currently beating Feral in Mythic Plus. In Red Encounters, they can rest easy. They can sleep some sound nights because in Red Encounters they are beating Destruction Warlock, Protection Warrior, and Outlaw Rogue. So at the very least, look at the glass half full, Feral Bros. You are not the last in Red Encounters. That being said, they still required a buff. Again, I don't think this is going to change too much. Feral has other problems and issues just than how much damage they can do. That being said, this is still better than nothing. It is still going to make them stronger, which is a start, I guess. We also do have the next buff, which is to Beast Mastery Hunter. So the buff to Beast Mastery is a 3% damage increase, flat out, plus an extra cap limit of Beast Cleave, because Beast Cleave had reduced damage after 5 targets. Instead, now the reduced damage of Beast Cleave is after 8. So they will have more consistent AoE damage in Mythic Plus pools. That being said, of course, in Mythic Plus, it's marksmanship that is way more popular than Beast Mastery at the start of this patch in the higher keys. So this is likely still not going to change anything, since that's why you bring a Marksmanship Hunter, because of their burst damage. This is not going to fix too much for Beast Mastery, but at the very least, it's going to make their AoE more consistent. Similar discussion, although not as bad in Red Encounters. Beast Mastery is also doing quite badly in Red Encounters. It is currently at the bottom 5 of performers in Mythic raiding, while Marksmanship is in the top 3 at the moment. So I think this is definitely deserved of a buff to Beast Mastery, even if Beast Mastery scales very well as a spec, and they are bound to become quite powerful the later the tier is, the more gear they have, etc, etc. I still think they needed some help in terms of their performance. Then we have another significant buff, although I don't think it's going to affect too much for the moment, which is Mistweaver. So just like a few other specs that we mentioned the DPS and the tanks, we haven't stopped to talk about Mistweaver. Mistweaver is quite underplayed in Mythic Plus. The only spec pretty much they are beating is Discipline Priest, and that's mostly thanks to Holy Priest being that much stronger. So in Mythic Plus things are looking quite bad. In Red Encounters it's looking better, not enough for them to be better than when they were before, which is the 5th most played healer, or the 2nd least played healer, however you want to see it. So this buff is not really going to impact Mistweaver in the raid, because the buff is that your spinning crane kick is going to be doing 30% more damage. It's a quite large number, 30% more. Of course, in Red Encounters, hitting mostly only one target, perhaps 2 targets, spinning crane kick doesn't get much value. It's in Mythic Plus that you can gain much more value from spinning crane kick. You know, the problem of Mistweaver is that they do very, very low damage at the moment as a healer. You know, even with the double legendary allowing you to play with your Sinister Teachings Ventir legendary together with your Ancient Teachings of the Monastery legendary, so you can go full fist weaving, you can go full melee damage as a monk, even then they struggle to get past 3000 DPS in a key. You know, when one of the best logs of a DPS of a Mistweaver in the 99 percentile is doing 2600 DPS, you know, it's quite low. So I guess it kind of helps that about 30%, almost a third of your damage in Mythic Plus comes from spinning crane kick. So buffing it by 30% is going to definitely give you a bump up in damage in Mythic Plus. Still, we are starting from such a small base of damage for Mistweaver that it's likely not going to change too much the hierarchies of healer damage in Mythic Plus anyways, but it's still better than nothing, I guess. Now we move on to perhaps the worst of the buffs here, which is the buff to Outlaw Rogue. Outlaw is getting their Blade Flurry now striking enemies for 50% of normal damage instead of 40% of normal damage. Now, Outlaw has fallen quite a lot, to say the least. At the moment, they are the least represented in the raid, in Mythic Raiding. Across all roles, they are the least played. And guess what? They are also the least played across all roles in Heroic as well. And for Outlaw, things get worse in Mythic Plus as well. It's quite jarring if you remember the old glory days of Outlaw from BFA and Legion, but even in Mythic Plus nowadays, in all keys, they are the least represented spec in all roles, only matching Feral Druid. And then in high keys, they are only beating Affliction, Feral, and Assassination. So the situation for Outlaw is quite bad, which is why this buff is terrible. We all know all Outlaw, all the handful of Outlaw players left know what they want, and that is removing the target cap of Blade Flurry, not making it do more damage. Doesn't matter if you do 50% of normal damage instead of 40. If you are going for a fat Mythic Plus pool with 20 enemies, and you with your puny Blade Flurry are only hitting 5 of them, right? That is the problem for Outlaw at the moment. So cool, it's a buff. Not cool, it's not what they needed. On to the next 2 buffs. These are 2 of the same blanket power increase that Unholy received. These are the buffs to Elemental and to Destruction. They are both getting buffed by 5% in damage. So the more understandable of the 2, of course, is Destruction. Destruction is the 3rd least represented spec in Mythic Raiding. They are towards the bottom in Heroic, and they are not very well represented in high keys in Mythic Plus either. Many people are kind of worried that this buff to Destruction coupled with their double legendary and, more importantly, their 2-piece and 4-piece set bonus working together is going to give them tons, or rather even more, because they already have tons of AoE damage, is going to give them even more tons of AoE damage in Mythic Plus. I don't think it's that relevant. Destruction perhaps works better than Demo in very big and coordinated pools in high Mythic Plus keys. It's not the normal average pug group that is going to be able to take advantage of the full power of Destruction, and even then they still have other problems like single target damage being pathetic. So this is a more acceptable buff to Destruction as opposed to the other one, which is the one to Elemental. Elemental is getting buffed by 5% across all sources of damage. They are currently middle of the pack in Mythic Raiding. They are, however, when it comes to single target, one of the strongest single target specs in the game. Very fitting for this video, a few days ago we looked at the Skolex pure single target boss fight, and Elemental has the second most damage in single target out of all the other specs in Mythic Raiding. Even Dosen, which is a one target to two target kind of fight, Elemental is still in the top half, is in the top 7 of damage on Dosen as well. So the popularity is in the middle of the pack. The performance is in the top 10, and the single target performance in the raid is in the top 3 or top 4 of specs. So as far as raiding goes, they look fine. They shouldn't really get a buff. Meanwhile, the other problem is Mythic Plus. Mythic Plus was the problem because we mentioned in yesterday's video about Mythic Plus how Shaman had dropped from the tail end of Season 2, where they were quite popular as a Mythic Plus burst AoE spec. They dropped by quite a bit. Now, this is because, possibly, Elemental received a very bizarre nerf about 3 weeks ago, which was the nerf that we covered, the nerf about Storm Elemental, right? The change was that the Wind Gust, the buff that increases your cast speed of your Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning every time you cast them, was only going to stack to 10 instead of stacking to 20. So you were only gaining 30% more cast speed instead of 60% cast speed. And on top of that, if you resummon your Storm Elemental while your previous Storm Elemental is still active, which is something you can do because of the extreme cooldown reduction you can get from your double legendary combo and your 4-piece set bonus, if you did that, you wouldn't have kept the previous stack that you gained. You went back to 0 and you had to regain all those stacks back up. This was a big nerf. This was like 15% AoE damage nerf done to Elemental Shaman. And more pathetically, we covered this already, Blizzard tried to explain that this was a degenerate playstyle, that this was uncomfortable to play because spamming one button every 0.6 seconds gets tiring and even painful, so they wanted to remove this playstyle. There's only a problem. The problem is that they removed the playstyle with a massive nerf without giving any type of compensation buffs. That is like saying Affliction's many dots are uncomfortable, so we are going to fix Affliction by removing Curse of Agony, Corruption, and Unstable Affliction. Have fun. You need something in return. You needed a compensation buff. Elemental hasn't gotten any for 3 weeks, and this is the compensation buff, apparently, of the 5% damage increase. As I said, it's kind of weird, because by now you have already ruined the reputation of Elemental in Mythic Plus. Players have grown disillusioned at the power of Elemental in Mythic Plus after the Storm Elemental nerf, and now with this buff you're not even just buffing back the AoE, you're buffing also the single target that Elemental already has quite well. So it's a weird buff for Elemental. It is weird in the timing because this compensation buff had to come much earlier. It is also weird in the type because this is not just buffing the AoE that Elemental lost, but is also buffing the single target that they already have. So overall, this is likely the better of the buffs of these specs, but also the worst in the sense that it's not what the spec needed overall. Now, on to the last of the buffs. This time around, our dead spec. We mocked, jokingly of course, we mocked Protection Warrior for a while for being so underplayed. So now Blizzard is going to buff them. There is a series of buffs for Protection. Ignore Pain is now reducing 55% of the damage instead of 50. You have Demoralizing Shout, which is going to reduce the damage enemies do from 20% to 25%. You have the Ignore Pain Rage reduction cost. This is very good. From 40 Rage to 35 Rage. The cooldown of Spell Reflection for an even stronger magical damage reduction immunity for Protection went from 25-second cooldown to 20-second cooldown. And lastly, Vanguard reduces all damage taken by 15% instead of 10%. This is, by the way, in case you're not familiar with the term Vanguard, This is just a passive. This is just the passive bonus you get whenever you become a protection warrior. So you're taking 5% less damage just by being protection warrior with this buff. So it's a quite solid series and set of buffs for protection warrior, which is also what was necessarily needed given their situation in both raiding and Mythic Plus. They are the least played tank by a mile in both raiding and Mythic Plus. They are the second least played spec across all roles in with encounters, and they are the sixth less played spec across all roles in Mythic Plus. But that's mostly because tanks only have 5 options as opposed to the 24 of the DPS. Perhaps that's why we said that perhaps the buff to Elemental was the strongest out of all the specs. This one is likely a contender. It would be, in a vacuum, the strongest buff. The problem is, much like the buff to Mistweaver, that the Protection Warrior starts from such a low base of power that even though this buff is big, it's likely not going to affect it as much as the buff to Elemental, who is already doing fine in some of the aspects of the game. For now, these are the changes. As I mentioned at the start, we have gotten already, and we will continue to have, some people screeching about their specs missing from this list of buffs. I already highlighted some of the more popular picks for buff requests. Red Paladin is always a hot topic. You have Shadow Priest, of course, an all-timer of buff requests. Affliction Warlock is popping up more and more as well in the buff requests, so I guess many of these buffs were expected given the low play rate and performance of many of the specs. A couple of those were a little bit more on the risky side. Both Elemental and Destruction have both pros and cons for these two buffs. We will see eventually what they will cause to both of these specs by next reset, obviously, because this is going live March 29th in NA, March 30th in EU. So we will have to wait and see. For now, we can stop here. On this blessed Sunday, where I am likely still stuck at my relatives, by now I'm pretty sure my uncle is telling me for the 6th time that one time that I got lost at the beach. I never heard it before. So, thank you guys for watching the video, of course, and for supporting the channel. You can continue to do so by liking and commenting on the video, but also subscribing to the channel. For today, my team of security guards have unlocked the subscription button to all of the people who have ever gotten stuck at a family meeting for what seemed like 8 hours. You can, of course, also follow me on Twitter over this place right there. I promise one day you will see a tweet of mine. And then, of course, you can also support me on Patreon, which is right over there, and will get you access to my Discord server. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, oh my god, I started this video and by the end we got like 15 more degrees. Jesus Christ. Oh.